Okay, let me just start off by saying that this wasn't intentional. Including this one, I have now done 3 videos in a row about the third game in a series. These are just franchises that were near and dear to my heart that just so happened to be high-profile mediocrity. And as far as I'm aware, you cannot sue me for this. I promise I'll move away from the dreaded number 3 after this, but since we're here, Lost Planet 3 was another one of those titles Capcom gave to a Western developer, which means the franchise went from this to this. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Join me, the resident gremlin, as we ask, how bad was Lost Planet 3 really? The story begins where every good story does, at the end. Old Jimmy's buried under some rubble and decides to reminisce about his life went this far south. Cut back 50 years and Jim crash lands on EDN 3 because it is physically impossible for anyone to land normally in a video game. After a quick tutorial and a brief explanation that you're on this deaf world to resolve the energy crisis, ain't that topical, the plot kind of idles? The game continues to explain game mechanics and character introductions, but the story ostensibly goes nowhere for a good few hours. I mean, yeah, Jim's a contractor and he's literally here to do a job and nothing else. When it's a 10-hour game and a fifth of your runtime is just going through the motions, sets a pretty bad precedent. It takes until we get to the top of Shackleton's Peak to fix the relay and seeing someone sabotaging the damn thing for it to really get started. Does make me question why there's no one stationed at or near the super important interplanetary satellite dish though. Probably because of the extreme conditions. Anyway, it turns out that it was no one from the base, so there's something else afoot here. And from there we come across the mysterious stranger again, running around a cave, and our T-post melts a glacier. Something it only does once during this plot-mandated section to reveal this super abandoned base that definitely shouldn't exist if the totally trustworthy Megacorp is to be believed. A quick jaunt and we discover that this isn't the first time people have been on this planet, and that something went seriously wrong the last time and it wiped out the first colony. Jim makes a copy of the evidence because the giant, easily accessible complex isn't good enough apparently, but runs into a minor snag which leads to him plummeting to his death. Luckily he survives, thanks to the mysterious stranger and her wacky super healing doodads. This is where we discover that the first colony survived and has been living here for 36 years, and man do they hate Nevek. Shocker. What follows is even more busy work before they let you go home and find the base under attack, because Kenny has made a machine that pisses off the acrid. You know, more than they usually are. Shut the thing off, return to the boss man brandishing evidence, and it turns out Braddock already knows and came back to this hell world to find out what happened too. Nice. Awesome. More busy work. Damn, that's a lot of this game, huh? And Bonnie calls you over to talk about the freaky megastorms that keep happening and her theory that they're coming from somewhere, as in being created by something. Back to the peak, do some science, and then discover more about the first colony, that Braddock was born on this frozen nightmare and his dad was a colossal dick and abandoned everyone else to die. But then we get a boss fight out of nowhere, and 8 hours in we finally meet this game's antagonist, who is a generic psycho mercenary man. Fine, sure, whatever. We go to do some more science with Bonnie, who seems pretty confident that having useful data will help negotiating with a private army, and then we learn exactly what wiped out the first colony, but not really. Soichi here discovered Nushi, a massive acrid that purifies T-energy so it can actually be used, but Nevek decided to drill into the enormous monster and expected nothing to go wrong whatsoever. So, them finding this place again is very bad. Luckily, the only people who know are the old man, Jim, and Bonnie, who has now found out bargaining with crazy soldier men far away from any legal ramifications is very bad for your health. Jim starts a war, recruits the kid to help scupper the satellite, robo-fights the Frenchman, and then learns Nevek has attacked the first colony people. Captain Crazy kills Soichi, captures Jim and Mira, drugs them and interrogates them for all they know. Also, he has Jim's family now for some reason or another. Braddock then helps Jim out of the slammer, gets all the crew to evacuate before blowing himself up with the small army. Also, he saves your family somehow. Then Kenny tells everyone Eisenberg plans to use his machine to weaponize the Acrid against them. So Jim goes to fight him inside the big Acrid and then decides to kill it to save everyone or something. Jim kills the bad man, drags himself to safety because he's cut his own leg off, and then we get the cliff notes from then until now, where Jim finally dies and the game just ends on a cliffhanger. Hopefully from my meandering run through the plot, you've seen two very distinct issues with this game. For those that didn't, and because I need to pad out the runtime of this video, allow me to explain. 1. The pacing. The story seemingly goes in fits and starts. You get very little plot for the first 2 hours, then get a whole dump of story, and then another stretch where the story just sits around until you finish playing around with whatever new gizmo the game has given you for this event or for one particular task, then blasts out the rest of the story in 2 hours of gameplay. As I said, Jim is a contractor and is basically a jack-of-all-trades handyman, meaning he ends up doing a lot of menial and boring tasks, but even when the story feels like it's going somewhere, it peters out until the final act, which leads to 2. The stakes. The game seems almost allergic to tension, as in every possible conflict or issue just kind of resolves itself. There are other people on this seemingly uninhabited planet that might be a danger to Coronis. No, it turns out they're people that just want to live in peace. But they hate/are distrustful of you because you work for the people that abandoned them. Don't worry, do a quick mission or two and they welcome you with open arms. Confront the boss about the existence of the first colony, potentially throwing yourself into the fire? That's fine! Your boss is secretly trying to uncover the truth about them as well. The only time the stakes get high and stay there is when Eisenberg and his goons in 80s sci-fi armor show up, but then it's super overt and literally pointing guns at you. Hell, even when it's revealed he has your family, that situation just wraps up off screen. All told, I wouldn't say the plot is generic per se, but it does feel like it doesn't really know where it's going half the time. The main saving grace is genuinely the characters, so let's chat about them for a bit. Starting with Jim Payton, main character, Nicolas Cage lookalike, and all-around a normal human being. And I don't mean that as a negative, with most shooter protags being the equivalent of strategically shaved gorilla, the protags of LP2 being a random assortment of unnamed weirdos, and extreme conditions protag being Wayne. It's nice to actually have a fully realised person. He's got character motivation for being there. He has personality that isn't just gruff soldier man. And he interacts with people like a person would most of the time. And you get to see him develop throughout the game, where he's questioning his choices, thinking about what's best for him, his family, Coronis, and the first colony. He doesn't have all the answers, and he makes very human mistakes and choices, especially at the end. But he's refreshing in how normal he is, I guess, which is a rare thing to say about a lot of protagonists, even in modern titles. We do also have the supporting cast of characters, and they are honestly a bit one-dimensional. To start off with, for the very least, Gale, yes, this Gale from LP1, is this socially awkward techno-whiz, all wide-eyed and everything, almost to an annoying degree. But as the game progresses, he becomes this fiercely loyal and dependable ally. And the only real gripe I have is a lot of his development happens off-screen. Game is a habit of that, by the way. Then you have Braddock, the guy that could easily be described as a company man for half the game, and is by Bonnie at the start. He slowly becomes more interesting when we begin to discover his motivations and his past. The best part about him, in all honesty, is his actions in the final chapter. He storms into your cell, face full of thunder, acting like you've betrayed him for not telling him about the survivors, only to then aid your escape, save your family, and then take out Eisenberg's entire army in one of the most believable moments of self-sacrifice I've seen in gaming. The rest of the Coronas crew doesn't really get much development, if any. Bonnie is the scientist that everyone ignores for some reason, and Kenny is, well, the Sheldon archetype. Maybe later seasons, though. And the most that can be said about LaRoche is that he's French.
You betrayed everyone present, and now the White Fox will avenge them. Did he just call himself the White Fox?
But later in the game, he does fill the asshole with a heart of gold trope, which adds a bit more to the man, but doesn't really count as development in my opinion. Out of the 3 remaining characters, I'm choosing to ignore Grace because she's essentially a plot device. Soichi is honestly the only one who I really think bears more than a passing mention. Mira is kind of like Grace as a plot device, but with a bit more direct impact, and Eisenberg is just a stereotypical evil company paramilitary commander, unhinged, vicious, and ultimately uninteresting. But Soichi, oh boy, this man has been through the ringer. He has fought for survival of those left behind by Nevek, whose hatred for them has been bubbling away for 3.5 decades. But he's also wrestling with his own demons, the knowledge that his own mistakes and ambition led to the first colony being lost. And this is all conveyed brilliantly by his voice actor, possibly the best in the entire game. Outside of a few outliers, the cast feel very human, and while the handling of the plot wasn't very good, the writing for the characters goes a long way to making up for that. Obviously, we need to talk about the gameplay, and as always, it's best to compare to previous titles. Lost Planet 1 and 2 were very twitchy, for lack of a better word. There was no cover system, so you had to react fast and shoot faster. LP3, on the other hand, is a generic cover-based shooter, which is frankly the daftest design choice in history, because typically, cover-based shooters are built around the player fighting dozens of guys with guns in rooms full of chest-high walls. The issue here is you're fighting the Acrid, a species of weird insectoid monsters that fight by throwing themselves at you, meaning you need to be more mobile than squatting at random pieces of furniture will allow. Honestly, there's only one enemy type that really requires cover outside of the human enemies in the endgame, and these bastards will haunt my nightmares. Otherwise, it's a mostly competent shooter, and I say mostly because the shotgun, the first weapon you get in the entire game, is probably the best weapon for 90% of encounters, with the pulse and assault rifles filling in for longer range fights, which happen much less frequently than you'd expect. But what about boss fights? Lost Planet has always had pretty solid boss fights, right? Well, I wish that was still the case here, but every single one plays nearly the exact same. Dodge their attacks until they leave their big orange weak point exposed, wail into them until they're free again, rinse, repeat. Which is a special kind of bad when a fist fight between a giant enemy crab and a mech just ends up as pressing the same 3 buttons in the same sequence for about 3 to 4 minutes. There has to be an award for making the coolest thing on paper, not even a chore, more like photocopying handouts for a business meeting. At least the final boss is kinda cool if we ignore that it ends with a bloody QTE. There is, however, a bigger issue. Not just with the shootering, but with the gameplay as a whole. This game is so goddamn slow. Basically, every aspect is like molasses. Let's start from the top, shall we? This is the walking speed. It's pretty slow, right? Luckily, we have a sprint that's actually not that much faster. It's like a light jog rather than a sprint. Now, this is pretty bad in and of itself, but typically most areas you need to travel to on foot are either really short or the vendors are very close to the entrance, unless we're talking about Kenny's lab. So I timed it, and from entering the base to Kenny, it takes 2.5 minutes. And considering you need to walk there and back every single time you complete one of his side missions, it just takes so damned long. Don't worry, you travel most of the overworld in your utility rig. That's just as slow, are you kidding? I remember when getting in a VS in 1 and 2 was exciting. Now it's like, wow, I can't wait to pilot my 2-story apartment from A to B, because that's all this mech is for. Travelling from one dungeon to another. But at least there's a fast travel system that only works at the entrance and exit of zones, so it's effectively useless. Wonderful. But wait, we got a grappling hook. The grappling hooks in previous games were fun. Janky as hell, but fun. There's absolutely no way they could make a grappling hook boring.
You maniacs!
You made it boring! The grappling hook is a glorified elevator. It doesn't help with traversal, it is traversal, and only functions at predetermined points. Very predetermined, which is a problem all over this game, really. You have to be within the same molecule as an interactable to interact with it. It is really strict, but let's move past the fact that Continental Drift is faster than this game and look at what new things they've added to the mix. They gave us side missions. Woo! Yeah, definitely excited. I am frankly indifferent to side missions in most games. I'll do them, but if you want me to keep following quest lines, you better make them fun and engaging. And let me tell you, Lost Planet 3 absolutely bloody doesn't, because every single one is a fetch quest with extra steps. Go back to the area you've already been and collect T energy from a T post. Go back through a dungeon again and use the new upgrade for literally only one instance to get a thing. Guess where you have to backtrack from one of our cryptic riddles and then look up the answers online and get to backtracking. The only one that isn't a fetch quest is Kenny's, and even that is just backtracking to kill a bunch of enemies, which wouldn't be so bad if it didn't take 4 minutes to walk to and from Kenny's lab every time you wanted to turn them in. But at least the rewards are worth it, right? Right? Special ammo you'll probably never use, a targeting reticle for blind firing from cover, and minor stat increases you'll never notice in general gameplay. They just made everything so tedious and boring. The adrenaline rush the previous games gave you is gone and has been replaced with the most generic gameplay and busy work to pad out the runtime. While the gameplay is aggressively meh, and this is a very minor part of the game, I want to give a very special shout out to the repair animation, because it is literally just tapping away on his wrist computer thing. Like I said, it's very minor and has no real bearing on the quality of the game, but when the animation they use to repair sparking electrical panels is not even interacting with the panel, it does smack a lot of can't be asked. That and the rig valve rotate prompt being goddamned wrong. End of the day, is Lost Planet 3 a bad game? If we were judging the game purely by its story, being propped up by how genuinely well written the characters are, I'd say it was semi-decent. But we can't, and sadly, the gameplay just drags it plummeting back to earth. It's so generic and slow and utilitarian. It's a very no-frills experience, which is worrying compared to other cover-based shooters of the time, and downright damning when compared to the absolute madness of its predecessors. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Please like if you did, and maybe subscribe if you want some more. And feel free to leave a comment letting me know your thoughts and opinions, and maybe even some suggestions for other games to look at. I am the Resident Gremlin, and I'm starting to understand why Valve hates the number 3.